I think really the most helpful thing for just people in general is, opening the door for open, validating communication. And I think when you're supporting someone else, or even when you're looking for support, it's not about problem solving. It's not about solving the problem. It's just about being heard. So if you can be that supportive person for someone else, just be there for them. You don't have to try to solve the problem. Oftentimes the problem can't be solved, or we don't know what the outcome will be, but it's about knowing that there's someone there for you. You're not alone. And there's someone that you can talk to when the emotions might feel a little bit more than you can handle.
Do you want to wake up feeling like you're stepping into who you're meant to be, into the best possible version of you? What if I told you that the key to your best life, health, and happiness are all around you? You just have to find what works for you. I'm Hope Pedraza, and I believe that there isn't just one way to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that all you need is a little inspiration to make changes that last from the inside out. Each week, I'll be sharing tangible tips and inspirational interviews to help you on your journey. These are the steps to take to improve your life and live with purpose. This is Hopeful and Wholesome. Hey y'all, welcome back to Hopeful and Wholesome. Today I have on the show Dr. Nicole Andreoli. She is a licensed clinical psychologist based in New York City, and she has experience working with children, adolescents, and adults to address a wide range of social, emotional, and behavioral issues. Her specialties include things like anxiety, depression management, relationship concerns, and transitional issues. And we're really honing in today on the anxiety and the depression piece of this. And really getting to the root of the anxiety and depression, how our thinking patterns play a part, how therapy plays a part, things that we have to untangle to really unwind where this anxiety and depression is coming from, and signs of high functioning people that are dealing with anxiety and depression. And maybe they don't even know that they are experiencing that, but because they're high functioning, and how our culture is affecting things like anxiety and depression and this hustle culture that we live in. So many good things to untangle here. So if you are someone that is dealing with anxiety or depression, or you have someone in your life dealing with anxiety or depression, this is a really good episode to share with them and the insight that Dr. Andreoli is going to share with us. So let's jump in. All right, y'all, let's jump in. I'm here with Dr. Nicole, and we are talking all about anxiety and depression today. And I told Dr. Nicole before we started, before we hit record, this is so common in my world. Anxiety and depression plays into so much of what the women who come to me for are dealing with. And so I'm excited about this conversation and for her to kind of unravel and untangle a lot of patterns that play into these things. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So I kind of want to start with, if you can give us you don't have to get super sciencey with it unless you just want to, but can you give us kind of like a clinical scientific definition of anxiety and of depression, just so people can get kind of like the big picture before we dive in?
Sure. When we're talking about anxiety and depression, both, we're talking about symptoms that everyone feels in everyday life, but taken to an extreme. So we're typically looking at these types of symptoms at a level where they're starting to interfere with what we would call adaptive functioning. So your ability to really go out, do your day-to-day activities of daily living and functioning. For anxiety, it's feelings of stress, worry, nervousness. All of those are very normal. When we experience them to this level where it's negatively impacting our ability to function, that's when we're looking at what we would say meeting criteria for a clinical disorder, meeting criteria for general anxiety disorder, or like a social anxiety. And depression we can think of it the same way, just thinking of sadness. Very normal to feel sadness. There are things that just happen as part of the human experience that causes to feel sad. It's when that sadness is at its extreme. So now you've kind of spiraled and you're experiencing symptoms like not being able to get out of bed, not being able to engage in your normal activities. So again, interfering with that daily functioning, your inability to cope with daily life. That's where we're really looking at these, the clinical level of both.
Right. So then what is kind of the line? And here's where, and I had to ask this question because I've had people who come to me where they feel like they have anxiety or depression, but they haven't been,
Mhm.
properly diagnosed. But like I feel like I have these symptoms. So what, because I know there's kind of I feel like there's kind of this fine line, right? Like you can be like just like you could be a high functioning alcoholic, right? You can be a high
Mhm.
functioning person with depression or anxiety and still have these, what you were saying kind of fits into this criteria. So I guess what is that line for people who maybe they are high functioning, but they have anxiety or they're high function, they have depression? Like what is that line that kind of pushes them over the edge? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I guess there's a couple different ways that I could answer this because one would be what's unique for the person. What kind of
Mm,
triggers or what kind of symptoms are we looking at that we can say, you know what, this is a little bit more than you're just having a rough couple of days.
right.
You've kind of crossed over into this diagnosis territory. And I guess the easiest way to really look at that is the way that we diagnose, we have guidelines that we look for. And the DSM, it's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. That's kind of the governing rules
Mm-hmm.
that psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers use to make their diagnoses. You're typically looking at severity and duration of symptoms. So anyone can have a rough couple of days. There's this trigger, there's something you're really worried about, or something happened, you've experienced some loss, and you have a bad couple of days. It's when those symptoms really start to persist beyond, this was just a little bit of a rough patch, that
Mm-hmm.
you're really starting to kind of cross over into diagnosable terrain.
Right.
And I think the DSM typically looks around maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months for different
Mm,
levels of severity. I will tell you, and I can only speak for myself and my practice and the way that I diagnose and treat, to some degree, it almost doesn't matter where you
yeah.
fall.
Yeah.
If you're experiencing, and choose your word here, it's all under the anxiety umbrella, but if you're experiencing stress, worry, apprehension, whatever it is, there are interventions, there are
Right.
strategies that can help you regardless of where you fall on that spectrum. And the same is true for sadness. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, at the higher extremes, the higher severity, we're looking at talking more intense type of treatment. But for the most part, with both of these, there is a range where, doesn't matter if you cross that line or not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're in pain,
Right.
you're suffering, you're experiencing something. Let's talk about ways that I not me, but any therapist can kind of help you cope and get to better back to a healthier place.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's important to say because I feel like sometimes I talk with my clients and or even just people in general, doesn't have to be my clients,
Mhm.
where they're kind of like waiting for like this moment where they're like, okay, now it's really bad. Like, and they kind of wait for this moment for like, I guess just the poop to hit the ceiling for them to be like, okay, well, now I'll do something about it. When, like you said, I think it's an important point to make that it doesn't really matter. Like, if you're not feeling like yourself, then you can do something about it.
Yeah, because it really is a skill set and it's
Yeah.
something that's important. It's a lifelong set of skills. How can I cope in the face of adversity?
Right.
How can I cope when I'm not feeling well? And I hear this with even with patients, but I hear it with friends and family all the time. Oh, I'm just really worried about this thing. I don't have anxiety. And I'm like,
Hmm.
but that is anxiety.
Right, right.
Maybe it's a mild version of it. You're not having panic attacks, you're not having some of these more severe symptoms, but
Right.
that is anxiety. Let's
Hmm.
talk through how can you make this bearable. It
Yeah.
is a part of life, but you don't have to suffer because of
Right.
it.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I'd love for you to kind of speak on, because I know there's kind of some thought patterns that can play into, let me use air quotes, like typical anxiety or typical depression. So what are these kind of thought patterns or patterns of thinking that play into these kind of, I guess, diagnoses?
Mhm. So there are definitely patterns of thinking, unhealthy thinking habits, I'd say, that contribute to the experience of anxiety and sadness. And what I often do with patients is actually have them kind of keep track of how they think throughout the day. What do your
Hmm.
thoughts look like? Because we can identify them. And then once we identify them, I can help, there are strategies to help kind of break those patterns. Some of the more common ones are things like mind reading, for example. And this is something we're all guilty of to some degree, right? Maybe you're sitting at work, you're at your office, you hear someone kind of whispering behind you, and you automatically think, oh, they're talking about me. And again, to some degree, it's kind of normal to feel that way, to think that way. But again, we're looking at patterns. When this becomes something that happens habitually, that creates a real spike in discomfort and anxiety, then this is something that we have to kind of work through.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, that person absolutely could be talking about you. But does that mean that everyone snickering behind you is talking about you? Should you be at an anxiety, level, let's say 6, 7, 8 on a scale of 1 to 10? So that's kind of how we would look at it. Reading is a big one. Catastrophic thinking is probably the biggest, and that's the worst case scenario thinking.
Yep.
And again, all of us do this. Where it's a little problematic is when, we're anticipating that something really bad is going to happen, but we're accepting it as fact and kind of reacting to it emotionally as if it's already happened. So I know I'm going to lose my job. I know I'm going to get bad feedback from my boss today. I know this person is mad at me. And we're having an emotional reaction as if this is what's happening currently, yet it's only one possibility of something that could happen.
So what are the kind of coping skills that you're helping people with to be able to combat these? Because I find that like any kind of pattern, whether it's playing into anxiety or depression, like these patterns are so often so hardwired in us. And it's like a whole rewiring, right? Like the brain has to rewire. So what kind of strategies are you giving people to, because I imagine for a lot of clients, I know for mine, it's like it's process. It's not like, oh, let's do this for a couple months and then it's fixed. So what is that kind of unwiring and rewiring the strategies look like for that those kind of like hardwired thought patterns?
So there's a couple different approaches. One of the main thing that I do is really help people that I work with to increase their awareness that these are the hardwired processes. Because if you're not even aware that this is what's happening, it's very unlikely that you can change it, right? You have to really have that kind of inner insight as to what's going on. And like I said, I do that through having my clients track their thoughts throughout the day, especially when they're tied to negative emotion. So you got angry at lunch today. What was going on for you? What were you thinking about? And then when we review that, we can look for those patterns in thinking. Most people tend to think in patterns. So if you're someone who, is triggered by the idea of someone talking about you, right? That mind reading, or you think in terms of the worst case scenario, that's typically your pattern. So we'll see that show up quite a few times. And then once you start to develop an awareness of that, it gets much easier to kind of break the habit. It's a bad thinking habit.
Right.
Sometimes it's also helpful to understand why you think this way. And that's when it's helpful to go back to past experiences. Did it develop from something in childhood? Was it modeled for you, right? Sometimes our parents are worriers or they think in certain ways, and we've learned to think that way, from watching mom and dad or some other caregiver.
Right. Right. Do you find with your clients or the people that you work with, do you find that, and you can just speak in general, it's not like you're keeping track of statistics, but do you find that when people are dealing with anxiety, depression, that the majority of the time there is an event, like a life event? And I'll say trauma. We've talked about trauma in other episodes, and this episode isn't specifically about trauma, but do you find that there's usually a specific event that's triggered that? Or do you find more often it's kind of just like we're talking like it's kind of been modeled or it's like a pattern? What do you find more common?
It's a good question. And it's a little hard to say because part of me wants to say, well, I think it's just kind of like a pattern that's developed over time. And particularly with anxiety, I think a good portion of people kind of have their triggers.
Yeah.
When these types of things happen, they tend to cause me to feel more anxious.
Right.
Where I sometimes think with depression, it tends to be here's a specific event, since sadness tends to be tied more to like some kind of a loss.
Right.
But it's hard to say that as a rule because it could be both. A trauma could cause the onset of anxiety.
Right.
It really could be both.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just curious how it happens. I find it's kind of a mixed bag where I see, but then you see it a lot more than it is. So I was just curious. So when you're walking through, just going back to kind of looking at, I don't want to say treatment, but just kind of giving people strategies and stuff. So what kinds of things, because like you were saying before, like there's a point where, you have this certain level, and then we might be talking about more don't know if severe is the right word, but like medication, right? Like there's
Sure.
that, thing that we can offer them with help. So what kind of things do you do? And you talked about kind of rewiring these patterns, but what other kind of things do you do for people? Because I know like there are people, and I'm asking for most people listening, like most people listening in my world, they're like try to do things without medication. And there are plenty of people on medication. It has its place. But it's like, okay, well, let's exhaust these other options before we do the medication. So
Right.
what are some other things that you might help people, like ways to cope and manage these things with before you would recommend medication?
Oh, absolutely. So I always start with kind of what I call the mental health trifecta. You have to have a good base, in order to have good mental health. So we're looking at nutrition, we're looking at not even exercise, but body movement. And those are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
So body movement, are you moving your body every day? Are you taking walks? Are you stretching? Are you doing yoga poses? You have to be moving. It's very important. And then the third piece is a good social network, a good support system.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's true for everyone, whether or
Yeah.
not you have symptoms of anxiety or depression or not, these are protective factors.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to help support mental health. So at a baseline, that's where I start. Secondly, or I guess kind of adding on to that, is looking at coping strategies. Even if you're fine today, at some point in your life, you're going to be worried about something.
Right.
So if you don't start implementing when you're feeling good, that's my recommendation. When you're feeling good, what are your coping strategies for when you're not going to feel good?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the things that you need to be practicing and getting really good at so that when you need them, this toolbox is ready to go.
Right.
It's really hard once you're already kind of activated and feeling really stressed and anxious to then learn how to cope with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this could be things like meditation, deep breathing. This is yoga. These are the tools that you want to have, that you want to practice, get into your daily, weekly routine so that they're ready for you when you need them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's the other important part too, is people understanding that there's kind of ebbs and flows to these. And
Mhm.
like some days you have good days and some days you have not as good days. And having just that toolbox available, and not in being having the mindset where it's like, okay, I feel good today, but I might need these tools tomorrow or whatever. And not just thinking like, oh, I'm having a good day, so I must be fine now.
Right. And I think to your point, the acceptance of the ebbs and flows
Mm-hmm.
and the acknowledgement of what is and what's out of your control is kind of that next piece in this treatment, because so many people come in and say things like, well, I don't want to be anxious anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I don't ever want to feel this way again. And I get it, right? Why would we? No one's seeking out anxiety. No one's seeking out depression. We don't want to feel bad, but we have to. That's the human experience.
Right.
And so acknowledging and being accepting of that, I can accept that I'm going to have bad days with my good days. I can accept that things aren't always going to be easy, is so important. And then focusing on what's within your control. So I
Mm-hmm.
can't control, and that's exactly that point, right? I can't control that I'm going to have bad
Right.
days, that things are going to trigger me and upset me, but I can control what I do with that emotion
Right.
when that happens.
Right. I find two things came up for me when you were saying that, because I find that the control piece is such a hard one for people, especially when you're dealing with anxiety. Because that's kind of, I mean, for a lot of people, that's the premise of it. The anxiety is the fact that you can't control anything.
Right.
And so I find that that must be a really hard thing for a lot of people dealing with anxiety. And I've had clients with anxiety. Again, I'm not a therapist, so I'm not working with them in the extent you are, but just having conversations around that. Do you have any insight on people who are dealing with that? Because I just see that being such a roadblock for people with anxiety, letting go of that control and kind
Mhm.
of surrendering to the emotions. And like, how do you walk people through that?
It's probably a one of the main components of this type of
Mm-hmm.
treatment, because it is really hard. And I think a lot of people fall into these bigger traps of anxiety because they're trying to control the
Right.
environment to feel safe.
Yep.
And so a lot of these like safety behaviors are put into place because, okay, if I don't do these things, I then don't feel anxious.
Mm-hmm.
But then that over control just leads to avoidance, which actually is fueling the anxiety. So a lot of this part of it is education. Really, it's right. It's understanding that if you're, to kind of put this in as an example to make it a little easier to understand, but say you have a fear of driving,
Mm-hmm.
and there are people, they're afraid of highways
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. And
Yeah.
so that makes them very anxious. And so instead of exposing themselves to the fear or finding ways to gradually work through it, they just don't drive.
Right.
Well, I could just take the bus and then I don't feel the anxiety. Well, that avoidance and over controlling the trigger, all
Mm-hmm.
that's doing is one, it's telling you that, yeah, this driving is scary and this is something to be afraid
It's
of.
confirming it. Yeah.
Right. So it's
Mm-hmm.
absolutely confirming it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's also telling you, you know what? You can't even handle this.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like on the surface, by avoiding driving and taking the bus, I'm not anxious anymore. I've solved
Right.
my problem. You're actually creating a bigger one.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of like this component of the work is really just kind of understanding how when you make those moves to over control the anxiety, the sadness, whatever it is, you're really just avoiding, which just makes the emotional piece worse.
Right. Yeah. And I think I did a podcast episode not too long ago about this, and I talked to my clients about this too. And I think that's the scary thing. And I mean, I imagine it's the same with depression too. Because it's one of those things like what you resist persists, right? It's like that
Mhm.
whole thing where it's like the more you avoid it, the more it's going to show up. And if you just face it dead in the face, then we can be aware of it and we can work to release it. But like, especially with anxiety, just because I have a lot of clients with anxiety, that's a scary thing to face
Mhm.
whatever it is. Cause I find a lot of times with my clients, at least there is, well, yeah, with all the clients thinking in my head, there's some sort of like trauma that's related to this anxiety piece that they've experienced. And that's the piece that they're avoiding. And so the anxiety is kind of like this blanket, like covering up the emotions that are under there that the trauma
Sure.
has, you know what I'm saying? So it's okay. How do you face these emotions without it just completely exacerbating your anxiety, you know?
Mhm. So there are a couple of strategies, and I know we're talking in general terms, so
Yeah.
I'll try to keep it kind of general. But, in general, with the anxiety, this is where your coping strategies really come in because a lot of people, what's so scary about the anxiety is the feeling, right? The physical
Hmm.
sensations, the
Right.
idea of being out of control of your
Of
body.
your body. Hmm.
And the truth is, you can only, as they would say, I'm using air quotes. I know everyone won't be able to see that, but you can only be out of control of your body for so long.
Hmm.
Your body is set to kind of activate. Heart rate goes up, body temperature goes up. That's where you feel the sweaty palms, maybe that feeling in the pit of your stomach. But that can only last for so long.
Right.
Your body is wired for that then to come back down. And you could aid in that process by doing things like deep breathing, by
Hmm.
doing things like a muscle relaxation type of exercise. And I think some people can confront the anxiety head on. You're
Yeah.
afraid of driving on the highway. You get in the car and you just go
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you just do it until it's not scary anymore. But that approach doesn't work for everyone.
Right.
So sometimes it might be more of a gradual process. Well, maybe first you're just going to imagine driving on the highway
Mm.
and let that anxiety come up and use your coping strategies to work through the physical sensations,
Hmm.
work through some of the thoughts that come up, because
Hmm.
even just that thought, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm going so fast. I can't control the car. That's scary.
Hmm.
And then once you can work through that, then it's okay. Well, what's the next step? Is it looking at the highway? Is it driving next to it? Is it being
Hmm.
the passenger in the car? And kind of gradually working up based on your tolerance to being able to drive on the highway.
Yeah. I like that. I like that process.
So there's a couple different strategies based on, the person's history, their unique presentation of symptoms. But almost always it comes back to, again, that toolbox of these are my strategies. This is
Hmm.
how I work through my physical symptoms. And this is how I work through, those cognitive thoughts that are creeping up and
Hmm.
contributing to how I'm
Hmm.
feeling.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I like those tools. So the other thing that came up for me earlier when you're mentioning some of the tools, and you mentioned that social connection and how that important that part is. And I know for a lot of people, and I guess mainly speaking with depression, which people with anxiety too, especially if there's like a social anxiety piece that's tied to that. People with depression a lot too, like they've kind of withdrawn. Like
Mhm.
that doesn't sound fun to them, right? Like forcing this social connection. So is there like a process? And it could be just kind of what you're talking about just a second ago with the car analogy, like imagining it and then kind of working through. But I guess what is a process for that for people who are dealing with depression, anxiety, and that we know that the social connection piece is important, but it can maybe make them feel worse. Like the thought of it makes them feel worse. It's just
Sure.
not something that, they want to put themselves through,
It can feel very overwhelming. Absolutely. So this is something that I would say with both anxiety and depression, you have to meet yourself where you are. Particularly, and with this example that you're mentioning with the social piece, depression comes to mind a little bit more, but it applies to both.
Yeah.
But especially with depression, where for someone, it could be really overwhelming thinking about getting up and taking that daily walk, right? That could just feel impossible. And what I would suggest is not forcing yourself to take the walk if you're not up to it, because that's okay, acknowledging where you are. But you have to also make sure that in making that decision, recognizing where you are and accepting that the next thought isn't some kind of self-blame or self-judgment or shame.
Right.
I wanted to make sure to make that point, because it's very easy to head in that direction, and that's just going to make you feel worse. So whether it's getting up to get outside, the social piece, whatever it is, you have to meet yourself where you are. So if going outside feels completely overwhelming and impossible, what's 50% of that? Maybe 50% of that is just standing on your doorstep. Or maybe that's still too much. And so all you can handle today is sitting by the window. And that's okay. That's where you are. That's then the goal for today. And the hope then is that tomorrow you can do a little bit more.
One day at a time. I like that. Little baby steps. And that's, with my clients, not even talking about anxiety, depression, it's always it's always the baby steps. People think we have to make these huge leaps to be on the healing path, the healing route. And it's just really all those little things. And like you're saying, I think that's the other piece too, is acknowledging where you are, but then being okay with it and, pushing the shame or the guilt or whatever it is that wants to come up aside. I like that. I would love for you to talk through kind of some misconceptions and maybe myths around anxiety and depression. I feel like there's a lot of those. And I feel like, you can scroll through Instagram. Like I read things sometimes where I'm like, I don't think you're understanding. So I'd love for you to go through just some that come to top of mind about misconceptions.
Oh, yes, there's a ton. With both, I think a little bit more with depression. The first one that comes to mind is this idea that it's a sign of weakness. And this I always hear more from the person kind of about themselves or fearing that that's what other people are thinking.
Yep.
I've never actually heard someone say it about somebody else.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's a very, it almost, and maybe I have a biased sample, I don't know, but it almost sounds like it's just internalized. I'm afraid other people are going to view me as weak because I'm experiencing depression.
Yep.
But that it's does such a disservice to the individual. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a lack of willpower. It's a medical condition. And regardless of who you are, your strength, your character, your values, your beliefs, you can be affected by it.
Yeah. That's a big one. And I'm going to stop you there because I am glad you said that one first, because I've experienced that with friends and family who have been through depression. And it's and especially, and I don't know if you see this in your world, but especially if it's somebody from a religious background, it's they feel like this is the ultimate, you know what I mean? The religious piece comes up of and I'm like, wait a minute, this has nothing to do with anything, actually.
Yeah. As far as mental health has come stigma wise, there still is a long way for it to go, unfortunately.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Sorry to interrupt you. Keep going. That was a good one though.
I think related to that, with the stigma is this idea that you can just kind of snap out of it. And you hear that with both, but particularly with the depression also, that, just snap out of it or just get up, right? Just
it's that easy.
Just if it were that easy, the person would have done that a while ago.
Right.
It's not something that willpower alone is going to cure. There's actually, professional treatment, there's support, and there's time that it takes for these things to improve.
Right.
I think the other one for me would be something like this comes up all the time, especially when you see celebrities suffering from depression or dying by suicide. What did they have to be sad about?
Oh, gosh. Yes.
Right. Or this idea that, they were always happy when I saw them. And I remember this in particular when Robin Williams died. And I think because the perception of him, he's a comedian, he's making people laugh, he's happy, he has a lot of money. How could he possibly be depressed? What does he have to be depressed about? And I think there's a couple of points there kind of dispelling that myth. One is that depression isn't a symptom that people wear like on their face, right? It's not always visible from the outside. It's some people are really good at masking, but that doesn't mean that they're not struggling internally. And what is triggering to one person doesn't necessarily have to be triggering to someone else. And it doesn't even have to be something that other people can understand or sympathize with.
Yep.
It can be a very unique, individualized situation. And I think it's really important that we're all sensitive to that fact.
Yeah, I think that is a big one. And I don't know if you were familiar with Twitch, who committed suicide earlier. That one hit me hard because I've followed him for so long, but that was what kept coming up, and I kept seeing similar comments. Like he was always so happy and he was dancing and this, but it's like you said, and I think it's the same with anxiety too. And I know I've seen things online when celebrities talk about anxiety or like dealing with panic attacks, and people kind of like downplay it. Like, well, that's not a real thing. Like, why can't you just kind of like control it? Right. Like, why can't you do something about it? And they kind of dismiss the whole like panic attack thing. That's not a real thing. And that's like you're saying. And I think that's important to understand is, I talk about bio individuality a lot. Like everybody is different. Everybody's triggers are different. And just because somebody has different triggers than you doesn't mean there's, like you're saying, theirs are less valid. And I think that, everybody's experience, we don't know everybody's, childhood experiences that led them to this point and the things that compounded. I was talking about this the other day with somebody. We were talking about big T and little T trauma. Like something somebody said to you in the second grade could be stuck in your body as trauma. And it doesn't have to be a big thing like you were sexually assaulted. It could be just something small.
Absolutely.
That's now a trigger for you. And it's just kind of going off topic, but I think it's important to understand that because everybody is different and everybody's life experiences are different, things affect them differently, and they're going to exhibit their emotions differently and things are going to trigger them differently. And yeah, I just, to confirm everything you're saying, I think that is a big one.
And the last one, and it really is just kind of an extension of this that comes to mind, kind of going based off of what you're saying, when it comes to anxiety and those triggers, a lot of times I'll hear things like, that doesn't even make sense. Why are you worried about that? Right. Or how could you be afraid of that? That it doesn't make sense. And the truth of the matter is of course it doesn't make sense. Anxiety, like by definition, is illogical. It's based on an emotional thought process, not a logical one.
Yes.
If you think about phobias, think of people who have clown phobias. Does that logically make sense?
Right.
Of course not. But the fear, that emotional response is there and it's very real. So it's a very insensitive thing to say, but it also is, based, I think, just on misunderstanding what these triggers, what they look like and how they actually contribute to the emotions.
That's such a good point. And I think it's true even for people who deal with anxiety, because I've had a client tell me that before. She was getting so frustrated with herself because she's like, this is so dumb. Like, why am I freaking out about that? Like, why am I? So it's that feeling too, where it's like, they want to like make it sound logical, but you're saying it's not. And that's the frustrating part where it's like, I know this doesn't make sense, but I have no control over it.
And I'm afraid, right? Like, I know it doesn't make sense, but I'm still afraid.
Yep, absolutely. You're so good. Do you have anything that you haven't mentioned yet in terms of like any other coping strategies or mindset, anything else that people who they're dealing with it, they have loved ones dealing with it, that could be helpful takeaways?
I think really the most helpful thing for just people in general is, opening the door for open, validating communication. And I think when you're supporting someone else, or even when you're looking for support, it's not about problem solving. It's not about solving the problem. It's just about being heard. So if you can be that supportive person for someone else, just be there for them. You don't have to try to solve the problem. Right. Oftentimes the problem can't be solved, or we don't know what the outcome will be, but it's about knowing that there's someone there for you. You're not alone. And there's someone that you can talk to when the emotions might feel a little bit more than you can handle. So I think that's probably my biggest ask, I'll say.
Yeah.
Just be that support, be a shoulder, be a lending ear, and not worry so much about solving the problem.
Yeah, that's good. Great advice. I have one more question I want to ask you that I like to ask everyone as we wrap up. But before I ask you that, can you let everybody know where they can find out more about you, what you're doing, how to work with you, all of those things?
Absolutely. So I am doing individual psychotherapy. I can be found on my Instagram at Dr. Nicole NY. My website, you'll have to remember my last name. It's drnicoleandreoli.com. But either way is an easy way to reach me and contact me and go from there.
Perfect. And y'all go, I'll have links in that in the show notes. Go follow her on Instagram. She's got lots of learning tools just looking at her Instagram page. So y'all can go learn from her there. So the last question that I want to ask you that I ask everybody, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
I think really being true to yourself, especially with social media taking over our lives. We're living in a world where everything that we do is for posting and content purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our true self, our values, our true intentions, our likes get really lost in that. Right. Because we're performing, we're posting for other people. That validation feels great, but it's important to not lose yourself in the process.
I love that. Such good advice. Thank you, Dr. Nicole. This was such a good conversation and so many things to take away. So thank you for sharing your insight, your wisdom, and just sharing your gift with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Hopeful and Wholesome, y'all. If you found value in this week's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast and leave a review to let me know what you thought. I'd love to know what you find useful in these episodes so I can know how to provide the most value I can to my listeners. And if you have topics you'd like to know more about, I'd love to hear those as well. So shoot me a message on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. It's at TheHopePedraza, or you can visit my website, hopefulandwholesome.com. Thanks, y'all.